So, who do you think invented computers, right? This is the Imitation Game. If you've ever seen the film The Imitation Game, it would lead you to believe that Alan Turing is the inventor of the modern computer, but he's actually not. But lots of people talk about him being that. He's the father of computing, how Alan Turing invented the computer age, right? He actually didn't. It was a man called Charles Babbage. The historical difficulty in producing error-free tables by teams of mathematicians and human computers spurred Charles Babbage's desire to build a mechanism to automate the process. It is considered to be the world's first computer. So back in the day, Britain were creating astronomy charts and mathematical charts, but they were doing it by hand, and sometimes people would make mistakes. So Charles Babbage had a desire to create a computer that wouldn't make a mistake. On the 14th of June 1822, Charles Babbage proposed the use of such a machine in a paper to the Royal Astronomy Society entitled Note on the Application of Machinery to the Computation of Astronomical and Mathematical Tables. This machine used the decimal number system and was powered by cranking a handle. The British government was interested since producing tables was time-consuming and expensive, and they hoped the difference engine would make the task more economical. So Charles Babbage invented the difference engine, and that is considered to be the first computer in 1822. And that's it there, that's the difference engine. It was just used for creating mathematical and astronomical tables. Right, but also some people consider the abacus to be the first computer. So the abacus was initially used for arithmetic tasks. The Roman abacus was used in Babylonia as early as 2500 BC. Since then, many other forms of reckoning boards or tables have been invented. That's an abacus there. So the reason that we get misconceptions is because a computer does not need to be electronic, nor even have a processor, nor RAM, nor even a hard disk. While popular usage of the word computer is synonymous with a personal electronic computer, the modern definition of a computer is literally a device that computes, especially a programmable electronic machine that performs high-speed mathematical or logical operations, or that assembles, stores, correlates, or otherwise processes information. Any device which processes information qualifies as a computer, especially if the processing is purposeful. So that's the reason that it's actually hard to define. So that's why it's hard to define when the computer was actually invented, because it could be argued that it's been invented several times throughout history, and also it's such a complex invention that it has taken the culmination of many people's inventions and many people's knowledge over many years to get the computer to what it is now. But it could be argued that there were computers in the past, and it's the same with basically all inventions of man. It's not just the invention at that time that has allowed the invention to come about, it's a culmination of all of the experience and knowledge of people who went before and the materials that are available to you at the time. Alan Turing, even although certain people consider him to be the father of computing, he actually doesn't start the process himself. He was actually helped by codebreakers from Poland. So Polish codebreakers cracked Enigma before Alan Turing. Alan Turing could not have cracked the Enigma code without the help of Polish mathematicians, and it is time to right the wrong and acknowledge their contribution, the Polish government has said. But few people realise that early Enigma codes had already been broken by the Poles, who then passed on the knowledge to Britain shortly before the outbreak of war. They even taught Turing how to build electromechanical devices which simulated the workings of the Enigma machine and enabled operators to cycle through one possible setting after another. So would Alan Turing have reached the heights that he reached if it wasn't for the previous knowledge of Polish codebreakers? And not only that, but they did show him how to do the mechanical devices as well. So probably, even although some people consider Turing to be the father of modern computing, the knowledge that he brought to the table wasn't completely his own knowledge, it was also the combined knowledge of the people who came before him. And so what I'm saying, how that relates to man's so-called evolution, is that if there was a period of time when, although I've proven that there was worldwide trade even millions of years ago, etc., and things like that, the world actually was harder. It was harder to traverse the world at that time. It was harder to travel the world at that time, and there could have been tribes. I've showed you that there's tribes even in the modern world who live an existence that is completely untouched by people from the outside. So then you would have got tribes that were completely untouched from the outside, and so there might have been certain tribes in the world who had advanced knowledge of things, but it didn't necessarily transmit on a mass scale. So again, it just adds into the idea that man's so-called evolution is not linear, and that is a problem for evolution. Man's so-called advancement of knowledge is not linear. There have been things which have been advanced in the past that we can't actually work out now. There were certain things that people have worked out thousands of years before, and then those things were rediscovered thousands of years later. For example, the Egyptians had knowledge of when Egyptians were putting the bodies in the sarcophaguses, they actually also cut out the lungs and the heart, and they cut out the major organs, and they put them in separate canopic jars, and they bound them and they preserved them, etc., things like this. So the Egyptians actually had a detailed knowledge of the human anatomy, but man didn't rediscover a detailed knowledge of the human anatomy until Da Vinci, which I think was in the 1500s. So for thousands of years, when the Egyptian society died out, they lost the knowledge of the human anatomy, and it wasn't rediscovered till thousands of years later. So there could very well have been people in the past who lived very advanced, but they died out and they didn't actually transmit that knowledge to any other people around them. So once again, what I'm saying is that man's evolution is not linear, but that is what evolution proposes. Another thing is the Antikythera mechanism. It was a very, very complex computer that has been dated to, I think, around about 250 years before Christ. The Antikythera mechanism is an ancient analog computer designed to predict astronomical positions and eclipses for calendrical and astrological purposes, as well as the Olympiads, the cycles of the ancient Olympic Games. Found housed in a wooden box, the device is complex clockwork mechanism composed of at least 30 meshing bronze gears. Its remains were found as 82 separate fragments, of which only 7 contain any gears or significant inscriptions. The largest gear, clearly visible at the right, is approximately 140 millimeters in diameter, and it had 220 teeth. So the Antikythera mechanism was also a computer, and that is dated to 250 years before Christ. So even although we consider Alan Turing as the father of modern computing, what I'm saying is that computing has existed in various guises throughout man's history, and it's very, very hard to tell when computing were invented or when many things were invented. There's parts of the Antikythera mechanism. It was a very, very advanced machine mechanism. That is a reconstruction of it. So it mapped the stars, and so you would have had to have had advanced knowledge of maths. You would have had to have had advanced knowledge of astronomy. You would have had to have created extremely miniature sized pieces. So you would have had, as it said previously when they produced the bracelet, that it was similar to what man can do now using a telescopic lens. Probably things like that are going on with the invention of the Antikythera mechanism. There's its component parts and all slotting together. So it predicted it would tell people when the start of the Olympic Games was in combination with the stars, and etc, etc. So it's a very, very complex thing, and there's no reason to say that it's not a computer. It is a computer. The artifact was recovered in 1900 from the Antikythera shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera, believed to have been designed and constructed by Greek scientists. The instrument has been dated either between 150 and 100 BC, or more recently they're saying it's from 205 BC. After the knowledge of this technology was lost at some point in antiquity, technological artifacts approaching its complexity and workmanship did not appear again until the development of mechanical astronomical clocks in Europe in the 14th century. So what I'm saying is that these people were so advanced. If these people had access to plastic, and they had access to the silicone chip, and they had access to electronic circuitry, they would have been able to invent the computer. The Antikythera mechanism is so advanced it is basically equal to that of modern computers. But these people could only use the tools that were around them in existence at that time, and in general there has been an advancement of technology as time has gone on, and there has been no extinction events in that man does record his knowledge now in writing on the internet. So it's much easier for people to come along and invent something new because they have all the knowledge from the past. These people were completely isolated, but they still invented the Antikythera mechanism, and it goes against what evolution says, because with evolution there's a constant linear progression of man's abilities, of all species' abilities. They constantly improve and they constantly change in an advancement style, not a regression. But that's not actually true. Knowledge has peaked and troughed many times throughout history. So another thing is the fish traps. So traps are culturally almost universal and seem to have been independently invented many times. These are essentially two types of trap: a permanent or semi-permanent structure placed in a river or tidal area, and bottle or pot traps that are usually but not always baited to attract prey and are periodically lifted out of the water. So again, what I'm saying here is that fish traps have been invented many times all over the world. In all various cultures, at some point people have worked out, I can weave a basket and I can catch fish using a trap. Now that means that basically all human beings in general have the same capabilities, but in something like the Antikythera mechanism, for example, sometimes extremely intelligent people are born and extremely special people are born, and then they can push a society forward as individuals. But as I say, back in those days, even though there is evidence of worldwide trade etc, they generally did. It does make logical sense that in the past the terrain wasn't as mapped out as it is now, it wasn't as well known as it is now, and they didn't have the advanced vehicles etc that we have now, so that it was harder to have communication with various tribes around the world, and the population was much smaller as well, so it's harder to go and find other people when there's less population, and it's harder to travel. But it still doesn't prove that man kind of generally, he came down from the trees and then he progressed into a Neanderthal, then he progressed into a human being. That doesn't really make sense, because people have been inventing the same things all over the world in various guises, and that means that basically all humans do have the same capability. But now and again, in certain advanced societies or whatever, there is people who come along and they can invent different things and they have special capabilities. But if you can't actually transmit your knowledge and you don't have a form of record keeping, then when your society dies out, then so does all your knowledge die out. But if we have proof of advanced cultures in the past, then it kind of disproves evolution, because I couldn't invent an Antikythera mechanism, but people in 250 years before Christ could. Another thing is bottle gourd. This is another thing about the fish traps, is that the fish traps are made from basket weaving. Now, we can't actually tell how advanced the people in the past were, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that they used perishable goods. So this is bottle gourd, and back in 10,000 years ago, they say bottle gourd was domesticated 10,000 years ago, but as I've already explained with the inventions, and you don't just domesticate something overnight, it takes hundreds of years to get it to what you want it to be. So bottle gourd started out small, but then they crossbred it until it became large, and then when it became large, they used it as bottles, and they used it for various mechanisms. They used it as carrying devices. But bottle gourd's not going to stay fossilised. Bottle gourd's not going to fossilise and have evidence for us to show, but it doesn't mean that they didn't have just as an advanced lifestyle as what we have now. This is instruments that can be made using bottle gourd. There's a kind of more rudimentary one on the left there, an instrument made from bottle gourd, but that is actually on the right there. That is actually what you can actually do with bottle gourd. That's how advanced it can be. But bottle gourd is a perishable good, and it's not going to survive for us to find it now in the modern times and see how advanced it is possible for those people in the past to have been. Now another thing is that scarabray here, just for me to paint the scene of what a daily life of an ancient person could have been, even a so-called Neanderthal. Scarabray is a stone-built Neolithic settlement located on the Bay of Scale on the west coast of mainland Scotland, the largest island in the Orkney archipelago of Scotland. It consists of 8 clustered houses and was occupied from roughly 3180 BC to 2500 BC. It's Europe's most complete Neolithic village, and Skara gained UNESCO World Heritage Site status as one of 4 sites making up the heart of Neolithic Orkney. It's older than Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids, and it has been called the Scottish Pompeii because of its excellent preservation. Now, what I wanted to show you here is, this is what one of the living rooms in Skara looks like, and you can see here in the middle that it's basically got like an ornamental stand, no different to a mantelpiece of what we have now. So you tend to think of people living far in the past as not having very many things, not having an advanced daily lifestyle, but if you can imagine a normal scene in a normal living room in any place in the world, and then you fill that with goods that we would have in our houses today, but those goods are made from perishable items, then really what is going to be left for us to discover? But I mean, these people are, it looks like a TV stand, that's how advanced it is. It looks like you could have family pictures on that, you could have mirrors, you could have anything really. The daily life that they could have lived could have been exactly the same as ours, no less advanced. And again, there's someone basket weaving. Basket weaving has existed for thousands and thousands of years. The earliest examples that they have found come from 12,000 years ago. There's a Native American Indian woman doing basket weaving. There's what you do on the left there. You kind of bend vines, get them ready to be used, and you can weave them together like that, like the man on the right. And that is the kind of quality of goods that you can actually produce. There's a handbag on the left there, there's a laundry basket or whatever on the right there. So what I'm saying is that if the things in the past were made from perishable goods, then how can we really know what their daily lives were? If they had fish traps, if they had bowls made from bottle gourd, musical instruments made from bottle gourd, handbags, clothing, ornamental things, basket weaving, then all of these things are going to perish, and we're not going to get a daily picture of how their lives were. But okay, so they might not have had television and they might not have had the internet, but apart from that, they pretty much, using bottle gourd and vine and, for example, things like the Antikythera mechanism, they had some advanced things, but in general their daily lives were no different to ours. I'm sure they would have played games like cards or whatever it was. They would have had their own games that they played to keep themselves occupied. The only thing that they're really missing is probably television and the internet. Apart from that, it would be easy to say that their lives were the same as ours, and I'm saying that that has always been the case, even in the time of the Neanderthal Man, because I've showed you examples of the Neanderthal Man using drills and producing jewellery that is to the exact same quality standard as what can be produced in the modern day. So let's just go on quickly now to get a more complete picture, just a kind of quick complete picture of how advanced people could have been and how similar they are to us now. So they found sex toys that date back to, possible sex toys dating back to 28,000 years. Ancient phalluses made from stone and dried camel dung started the trend for sex aids. A siltstone phallus found in Germany is said to date back to 28,000 years. It is quoted as being the oldest known sex toy ever discovered. Phalluses made from stone, wood, leather and even camel dung have all been found during excavations or referenced in historical text and images. A 28,000-year-old phallus found in Germany recently, for example, is quoted as being the oldest known sex toy ever found, while phalluses made from stone, wood, leather and even camel dung have all been found during excavations or referenced throughout historical text and images. So there it is there, and the 28,000 years ago was within the time of the Neanderthal Man. And if you're talking about sex toys, then you're talking about sexual pleasure and you're talking about having an orgasm. Sexual gratification for women is something that modern human beings think has only existed since probably about the 80s. But if we're talking about Neanderthal Man possibly giving his wife sex aids from 28,000 years ago, then it shows that they weren't thinking about, that they're talking about sexual pleasure and having orgasms 28,000 years ago. Were Neanderthals master tacticians? early human relatives used meticulously planned strategies to hunt Ice Age beasts. Forensic analysis of hunting sites has revealed Neanderthals' tactics. They used the landscape to funnel fleet-footed prey towards bottlenecks. They were then able to ambush them and kill almost indiscriminately. Neanderthals then only chose to butcher the best animals for meat. With their heavy, thick-set bodies and slow-witted reputation, Neanderthals are thought to have been fairly cumbersome hunters, but new forensic analysis of the hunting grounds where these prehistoric human relatives are known to have killed their prey has revealed they were in fact brilliant tacticians. Researchers have found evidence that Neanderthal hunting parties used the landscape to give them the advantage over their fleet-footed prey. Neanderthals, however, were much more heavy-built than their Homo sapien cousins and are thought to have been slow. Instead, it appears they herded their prey, which were often large herbivores like reindeer, horses, rhinos and bison, into areas where they could easily ambush them. They described Neanderthals as being careful tacticians, casual executioners and discerning diners. For the study, the scientists examined several sites where large collections of Ice Age animal bones have been discovered and are thought to have been victims of Neanderthal hunts. So hunting large game is a part of behavioural modernity. So what they're saying here is that the Neanderthal man was the king of his terrain and basically just ran and funneled animals into certain spots where it was easier for them to kill. So here we go here, the bison hunting site, the Garonne Valley. The researchers analysed several sites thought to be Neanderthal hunting grounds, including one where bison had been killed in Garonne, France. Here it appears the Neanderthals drove the animals up against a limestone escarpment where they trampled each other in panic and were easier for the Neanderthals to kill. So Neanderthals are chasing them and funneling them into this bit here, up against this wall, and then just running in and killing them however they liked. So, you know, these were not people who found it hard to kill large game, which is a part of behavioural modernity. The Neanderthal diet. A recent study revealed Neanderthals snacked on a wide range of meats, but a fifth of their diet consisted of plants. Fossils taken from excavation sites in Belgium, Grotte de Spy or Spy Cave, revealed a vast array of animals lived there 45,000 to 40,000 years ago. Bones of mammoths, woolly rhinos, wild horses, reindeer, European bison, cave hyenas, bears and lions, as well as the remains of wolves, were found alongside the remains of Neanderthals. Based on isotope studies of the collagen found in the Neanderthal bones, the researchers were able to show that their diet was markedly different from that of other predatory animals. They appear to have primarily fed on large herbivorous mammals such as mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses. Studies of the isotope composition of individual amino acids in the collagen also offered proof that plant matter constituted approximately 20% of their diet. So, as I said, hunting wild game is a part of behavioural modernity, and Neanderthals are killing mammoths, rhinos, horses, reindeer, European bison. They are totally holding it down. They're doing everything, and have the 20% of their diet is plants. There'll be a lot of people in the modern world now that don't have 20% of their diet as being plants, so they were clearly healthy and they clearly knew what they were doing. For example, they found that an assemblage of 4,150 bison bones from 137 individuals found in Muran, France, appeared to be a post-rut feeding ground when they were killed. So Neanderthals were killing, actually, you would probably think from looking at textbooks that Neanderthals were struggling to maintain their diets. Well, actually they weren't. They were killing a mass surplus of meat. So hunting tactics used by Neanderthals: the bison, they used topography as a natural trap. They exploited their flight behaviour. In the butchery, they only chose the choicest fat fillets and the rump. Well, I won't go through it all, but what I find interesting is the butchery. So they're saying selection of the finest meats, selection of the largest and fattest individuals, so they know how the animals were going to react. They exploited their flight behaviour, killed them easily, killed a surplus of their meat, and then butchered them to a very high standard. This is what Neanderthals were doing and could do, so therefore they were behaviourally modern and they weren't a different species. Neanderthals were expert butchers. Ancient hunters only took the choicest cuts from mammoths mammoths. Bones reveal animals were found at a Middle Paleolithic site in Quincio, France. They belong to mammoths, woolly rhinos, horse, bison and reindeer. The bones are between 33,000 and 55,000 years old. Archaeologists from INRAP believe Neanderthals may have butchered large herbivores, only carrying the meatiest parts back to their homes. This is because long bones were not found with the carcasses, so they weren't taking their spines away or unnecessary parts of the animal. They were killing them on site and then cutting them up on site and only taking away the big meatiest parts. Bones of large animals discovered in southwest France suggest that Neanderthals were more sophisticated at hunting and gathering than previously thought. Our ancient cousins may have butchered the bodies of animals such as mammoths and bison, only carrying the meatiest cuts back to their caves. French archaeologists came to this conclusion because long bones were missing from the carcasses of many of the animals found at the site in Quincy. Neanderthals lived at the site between 35,000 and 55,000 years ago. They also found the skull of a cave bear and several wolf bones. The experts think that all the bones belong to animals that were deliberately hunted or scavenged by Neanderthals who used the carcasses. Some of the bones have cutting marks showing they were butchered. The archaeologists noted a lack of long bones, which they believe shows that only the meat-rich parts of the bodies were carried back to the home. They think poorly preserved site may have been a carcass processing area, so they were very, very successful hunters and they knew exactly what they were doing and they were behaviourally modern. Neanderthal mothers breastfed their babies for over a year, just like humans. Researchers analysed the tooth of a 10 to 12-year-old child that lived in a cave in Belgium about 100,000 years ago. They found it was breastfed exclusively for 7 months, followed by a 7-month supplementation. Neanderthals breastfed their babies for over a year, just like humans, according to new research. Chemical analysis of a juvenile's tooth revealed it was reared on mother's milk for 7 months, with suckling continuing for the same period coupled with solid food. The change from breastfeeding to plants and grains can be established by looking at differences in the distribution of barium in teeth enamel. This enabled Dr. Manish Arora and colleagues at Mount Sinai School of Medicine to discover the early life diet of a 10 to 12-year-old child that lived in a cave in Belgium around 100,000 years ago. So caring for the sick and caring for the young is something that's behaviourally modern, and they were feeding their humans exactly as we do now. So they're no different and they weren't a different species. Did Neanderthals invent bling? The world's oldest jewellery made from eagle claws was worn by human relatives 130,000 years ago. 8 eagle talons were found at a site in Croatia inhabited by Neanderthals. They had cut marks that suggest they had been strung together with sinew. The claws cut from the feet of a white-tailed eagle have also been polished. Anthropologists say it is the oldest example of jewellery to be discovered. They say it suggests Neanderthals used them for symbolic purpose. They predate the arrival of modern humans in Europe by 80,000 years. Well, they don't, because they were modern humans, because adorning yourself with jewellery is modern human behaviour, behaviourally modern, so they weren't a separate species. It's the only scientific way that we can say what a human is through behavioural modernity, and as I'm going through these slides you're finding yourself that Neanderthals were behaviourally modern. This contradicts traditional views of Neanderthals as primitive and stupid. Scientists say they were in fact sophisticated and had sophisticated culture. Cavemen didn't grunt. Scientist says early human speech evolved rapidly into complex sentences. Professor Miyagawa notes single words bear traces of syntax. He says this shows the words came from an older, syntax-laden system. He believes humans combined an expressive layer of language, as seen in birdsong, with a lexical layer, as seen in monkeys. In a new study, one linguist argues that human language developed rapidly, with people quickly using complex sentences that sound like our own. The hierarchical complexity found in present-day language is likely to have been present in human language since its emergence, says says Miyagawa, professor of linguistics at Massachusetts. Most scholars believe that humans first started using a proto-language, which was a primitive kind of communication with only a gradual development of words and syntax. But according to Professor Miyagawa, single words bear traces of syntax, showing that they must be descended from an older, syntax-laden system rather than from simple primal utterances. So that combines with what I'm saying. I'm saying that humans are a part of infinity and they have lived on this planet in various guises for all eternity, and they may have suffered extinction events and they may have had to live in very, very tough time periods, but they've always been there. So what he's saying is that all speech basically comes from a previous syntax-laden system, so it makes sense that the language that we have now is just basically copied from the older language that existed before, from the people before. And that does make sense, because where language comes from is actually described as the hardest question in science. No one actually knows where human language came from or originated from. Since we can find syntax within words, there is no reason to consider them as linguistic fossils of a prior pre-syntax age, he adds. In his paper, Professor Miyagawa writes that a single word today can be internally complex, often as complex as an entire phrase, making it less likely that words we use today are descended from a pre-syntax mode of speech. So he's saying words are so complex that they cannot be, you can't boil them down to a common denominator. Words are complex within themselves, and sentences are complex. You can't regress from that. And that's what I'm saying with human species and all the species in the world as well. You can't, although evolution is saying that there are transitional forms for every single animal on Earth, there is no evidence of any transitional forms for any animal, and I'm saying that every single animal has irreducible complexity. You can't take a whale and then go back from that. Everything that a whale has, it needs it for its daily survival. Everything that a human has and a human can do, we need it all for our daily survival. Everything that a giraffe can do, it needs all of its aspects to be a giraffe and to survive as a giraffe. It's so complex that you can't step back from that. And it's the same with language. Language is so complex that you can't actually step back. There is no pre-syntax speech. Nationalisation, the word nationalisation for example, starts with nation, a noun, adds al to create an adjective, adds is to form a verb, and ends with shon to form another noun, albeit with a new meaning. So that's how complex just an individual word can be. Hierarchical structure is present not only in single words but also in compounds, which, contrary to the claim of some, are not the structureless fossilised form of a prior stage, he says. The oldest dentistry is found in a 14,000-year-old tooth. Evidence of the world's earliest dental operation has been discovered by scientists in the 14,000-year-old skeleton of a caveman suffering from toothache. Researchers in Italy discovered that a flint tool called a microlith was used to file away a rotting cavity to halt infection, just like a modern dentist's drill. The find represents the oldest archaeological example of an operative manual intervention on a pathological condition, according to Stefano Benazzi, a paleoanthropologist at the University of Bologna. The treatment went unnoticed for all these years. The cavity was described as a simple carious lesion, Benazzi said, detailing their finding in the journal Scientific Reports. Benazzi and colleagues show that forms of dental treatment were already adopted in the late Upper Paleolithic. At that time, toothpicks, probably made of bone and wood, were used to remove food particles from teeth. A beeswax dental filling was discovered in a 6,500-year-old human tooth from Slovenia, while dental drilling likely to remove the decayed tissue was discovered in a 9,000-year-old molar from a Neolithic graveyard in Pakistan. So Neanderthals are finding their teeth, they're having complex sexual interactions, they're adorning themselves with jewellery, they're having obsidian weapons, they're creating stone structures that weigh over 50 tons, they're creating magnificent art, they know how to do astronomy, they know how to do maths, they know how to do chemistry, they're doing dentistry. What can they not do? How are they not modern humans? and there is what the dentist drill would have appeared as, would have been like. Cereal was a staple diet in the Sudan 7,000 years ago. Neolithic teeth reveal traces of grains centuries earlier than first thought. Humans in Africa were harvesting and eating cereal 7,000 years ago, several centuries earlier than previously thought. The discovery was made after researchers found ancient barley and wheat residues on teeth of skeleton from Neolithic cemeteries in Sudan and Nubia. It is believed wheat was first cultivated in the Middle East about 10,500 years ago and spread out there to Central and South Asia as well as to Europe and North Africa, the latter faster than expected. So I know that there's a creeping expansion here going on when I'm telling you that Neanderthals weren't human, but now we're up at 7,000 years ago, and we know that 7,000 years ago people were human, and the Neanderthals supposedly died out about 28,000 years ago. But what I'm saying is that wheat was first cultivated 10,500 years ago, but it didn't turn up as cereal until 7,000 years ago. So that's how long it actually takes for some things to be achieved. And especially now in the modern world where we've got so many technological advancements, we can achieve things much quicker, but then they couldn't achieve things extremely quickly. The things that they were working out, agriculture and the crossbreeding of plants, is far more complex than someone now who would maybe come along and invent a new type of energy, limitless energy, something like that. The person who's inventing limitless energy has got computers, science, previous knowledge. These people had nothing, and they figured out how to crossbreed plants and create successful cereals for themselves and successful diets for themselves. So they lived in a much harsher environment, and that's why it took them quite a long time to create things, but they were fully modern humans. They were behaviourally modern. So this guy here, in a good comment that I found, is basically talking about the same thing that I am. He's saying it is still puzzling that a pre-literate hunter-gatherer should, after a couple of 100,000 years of technical stasis, because humans are supposed to be from 200,000, the modern human is supposed to be from 200,000 years ago, suddenly realise that by selectively breeding virtually inedible grasses over many generations that the result would be an edible crop. How did they manage that 7,000 years before Google? So he's saying basically what I'm saying, that I'm actually saying that modern humans are from millions of years ago. That's the earliest examples that we have found. But I'm actually saying no, further than that. I'm actually saying that the earliest humans that we have found are the people who survived an extinction event, and that there was also humans before that. And this is just to give you an aspect of how their daily lives, people from ancient past, their daily lives were no different whatsoever to the lives that we live now. They just don't have access to as many technological advancements. Stonehenge's builders feasted on yogurt, cheese and hog roasts. Pottery analysis reveals the diet of stone circles makers 5,000 years ago. Stonehenge's builders were not slaves, but instead willing workers who enjoyed the perks of feasting on dairy and meat. Archaeologists have revealed analysis of pottery shards found near the stone circle has revealed that the containers once contained yogurt, cheese and milk. Pig and cow bones, by contrast, were eaten further away and consumed in large open-air barbecues. Further research by the University of Sheffield found that many pigs were killed before reaching their maximum weight. The archaeologists believe this is strong evidence of planned autumn and winter slaughtering and feasting-like consumption. The ancient Britons preferred to boil and roast meat in pots around indoor hearths, as well as large barbecue-style roasts outdoors. The site showed that there were bones from all parts of the animal skeleton, which suggests livestock were herded to the site rather than transported there as joints of meat. Chemical analysis of the bones show that the animals came from many different locations, including some as far away as Cornwall, Wales and Scotland. The archaeologists write this is significant as it would require orchestration of a large number of volunteers drawn from far and wide. The observed patterns of feasting do not fit with a slave-based society where labour was forced and coerced, as some have suggested. So they were having barbecues, they had extensive relationships with people very far away from them. They were eating yogurt, they were eating dairy, they were eating meat, they were slaughtering animals based around feasts, and that was the people that made Stonehenge. and they were eating cereal 7,000 years ago, and then on top of all the other previous things I've been talking about, these people were advanced. So this is in contrast to what I'm saying, right? In contrast to what I'm saying, that man has always been capable, man has always been man, humans have always been humans. I'm only saying man because it's easier to say man, but I'm definitely including women in that as well. I'm not being exclusive. Okay, so this is what the evolutionists are saying in comparison to what I'm saying. Now I've showed you basically all the complex things that ancient humans were doing and could do, including the Neanderthal man. This is what science is saying. Man learned to throw 2 million years ago. Well, I've shown you at the start of these slides examples of modern humans being born 3.5 million years ago. That's admitted by science, but they're saying that it took man 1.5 million years to be able to learn to throw. Do you believe that? Do you believe there was ever a time where man couldn't throw? So change to the collarbone and shoulders allowed human ancestors to use spears. Scientists compared the shoulders of Homo erectus with modern humans. The researchers from the George Washington University measured the throwing ability of people from the Dasanch tribe in Kenya and Ethiopia. Dasanch people could throw sticks at 80 miles an hour over more than 100 metres. The scientists found that Homo erectus would have had similar abilities. Homo erectus could have rivaled modern athletes in their throwing ability. Early human ancestors may have evolved to throw spears, allowing them to hunt 2 million years ago. Scientists have found that the skeletons of early humans changed to give them the ability to throw like modern humans. A study of fossils of Homo erectus, an extinct human ancestor, shows that their shoulders and collarbone would have allowed them to hurl sticks accurately and powerfully. So science is saying that there was a large part of man's existence where he couldn't even throw. I don't believe that. What I can tell you is Lucy, for example, Lucy is the species that they have defined as being the species, example of the species that came down from the trees. But see, as we look into the past, all they have ever found is either a human or a monkey. That's all they have ever found, and Lucy was a monkey, and there is even YouTube videos, you can go and look it up yourself, where Lucy wasn't even bipedal, couldn't walk standing up, and they were having problems with that, with the hip bone. So what they did was they actually used a power saw. The hip bone wouldn't fit together in the way that they wanted it to fit together, so they used a power saw to saw it down and fit it together the way that they wanted it to fit together with Lucy, and you can look that up for yourself. Lucy was a monkey and it wasn't a human, and all that we have evidence of is either animals that were monkeys or animals that were humans. And what I'm saying is humans have always been humans, they've always been behaviourally modern, and they could always throw. Now this is what they're finding out now, is that we are actually, because we've lived sedentary lifestyles for so long, what I'm saying about there is a certain amount of genetic variation within a species, but it can't change from species to species. We have lived sedentary lifestyles for so long that we are actually far, far weaker than the so-called Neanderthal man and the ancient humans. And that is a big question that evolution would have to answer. So how modern humans have become weaklings compared with our ancient ancestors who could outrun and outlift today's top athletes. Human leg bones have grown weaker since farming was invented. Scientists found bone structure declined after agriculture emerged. Male farmers 7,300 years ago had legs of cross-country runners, but just 3,000 years later they had legs comparable to sedentary students. Mo Farah would have had some tough competition from ancient farmers living 7,300 years ago. Scientists claim if they were to cross paths, our ancestors would have been capable of outrunning some of the world's most talented athletes. That's according to recent research by Cambridge University, which reveals just how far our fitness has fallen in a couple of millennia. Even our most highly trained athletes pale in comparison to our ancestors. We are certainly weaker than we used to be. So we're weaker than we used to be, but evolution is saying at certain points humans couldn't even throw. It then compared the bones to that of Cambridge University students and found the leg bones of male farmers 5,300 BC were just as good as those of highly trained cross-country runners, but 3,000 years later the study found our ancestors had leg bone structures closer to that of the Netflix generation Macintosh used a portable 3D laser surface scanner to study the femurs, tibiae, shin bones of skeletons from Germany, Hungary, Austria, Czech Republic and Serbia. She found that male tibiae became less rigid and the bones of both men and women became less strengthened to loads in one direction more than another. Bone mass was found to be about 20% higher in foragers, the equivalent to what an average person would lose after 3 months of weightlessness in space. Okay, there's a man who's wrote a book and he's saying that ancient man would have been faster than Usain Bolt and stronger than Arnold Schwarzenegger. In his book Manthropology, the Science of Inadequate Modern Man, Peter McAllister says that a Neanderthal woman would beat Arnold Schwarzenegger in an arm wrestle. In a javelin contest, the Aborigine would claim the gold medal. The world record is 98.4 metres, but they could throw a spear a staggering 110 metres. He said, as a class, we are in fact the sorriest cohort of masculine Homo sapiens to ever walk the planet. His conclusion about Aboriginals' astonishing speed comes from analysis of 20,000-year-old footprints preserved in a fossilised clay pan lake bed in Australia. The prints are of 6 men chasing prey, and Mr. McAllister's study of them leads him to believe that they could hit 23 miles an hour on muddy ground. Usain Bolt reaches 26 miles an hour at the Beijing Olympics, but Mr. McAllister claims that with modern training and spiked running shoes, an Aborigine man would be capable of 28 miles an hour. Meanwhile, Neanderthal women would win a battle of strength with Arnie because they had 10% more muscle than the modern European man. With some weight work in the gym, a Neanderthal woman would reach 90% of Schwarzenegger's bulk at his peak in the 70s. However, because a Neanderthal woman had a shorter lower arm, Mr. McAllister believes she would slam him to the table without a problem. The anthropologist blames modern lifestyles for our decline in speed and power. He says in his book, at the start of the Industrial Revolution, there are statistics about how much harder people worked then. The human body is very plastic and it responds to stress. We have lost 40% of the shafts of our long bones because we have much less of a muscular load placed on them these days. So, in contrary to what evolution is saying, it isn't a linear progression of man, it isn't a linear progression of the species. We're actually weaker now than we were before. So I just wanted to get into this for a minute. What we're getting now is actually a revisionist history of Neanderthal artefacts, because the evolution theory is actually under threat from all the things that they're finding out about what Neanderthals could do. The evolution theory itself is under threat because if there was no Neanderthal man and the Neanderthal man is valued as being behaviourally modern and a full human, then the evolution theory is under threat because they haven't found any missing links, and then therefore the Neanderthal man is much more advanced than evolution would have us believe, and it pushes further back advanced humans further and further back into history, so it gets harder for them to explain their first events and explain how it takes millions of years for things to evolve. If every instance of man that they look at is a behaviourally modern advanced being, then there's a big problem for them to fill in the gap and say at certain points in man's history he was a devolved, non-advanced being. So what we're getting is a revisionist history with things like this. I think it's the Divigi baby. It's a flute that was found, dated from 55,000 years ago during the Neanderthal times in Europe during the Ice Age, so it was the Neanderthal man. But they're trying to say now, because that's a threat to the evolution theory, they're having revisionist history and they're going back and they're trying to reanalyse it and desperately cling to the idea that it's not. So, was the first musical instrument just a chewed bone? Neanderthal flutes were made by hyenas, study claims. Researcher says a bone flute found in Slovenia is not an instrument. Instead, he says it is simply a bone chewed by a hyena with teeth marks. He claims all such instruments were made by hyenas and not Neanderthals, and the bones do not even originate from Neanderthal times. So, as I showed you previously, the modern human from 3.5 million years ago, they won't let anyone else analyse that data, and it's against the zoological code. Also to show you the trends that they're trying to do a revisionist history and rewrite man's history to make him into a less advanced being than he actually was. I'm just trying to show you the desperation of some of the scientists out there trying to desperately cling to the evolution theory, even although the trends, all the information that's coming out now, the trends are showing that modern humans go back millions and millions of years, which evolution says is not possible. So it was heralded as the world's oldest musical instrument, a bone with 2 holes in it, seemingly made by Neanderthals to serenade their companions, but now a study says it's not an instrument at all, but rather simply a bone chewed by hyenas and left in a cave. The research suggests historians have been fooled by these phony objects, and in fact all such instruments attributed to Neanderthals are simply chew toys of animals. So let's look into the detail of it. The didgeridoo flute. If it is a form of flute, it is possibly the world's oldest known musical instrument. Alternative hypothesis notwithstanding, the artifact remains on prominent public display as a flute in the National Museum of Slovenia. The museum's visitor leaflet maintains that manufacture by Neanderthals is reliably proven. Researchers working at the site uncovered more than 600 archaeological finds in at least 10 levels, including 20 hearths. And as I showed you, using a hearth is behaviourally modern, so we're already getting indications that people who lived around this artefact were behaviourally modern. So it would make sense that they were interested in making art and music if they were behaviourally modern, having hearths as an example of that. The skeletal remains of cave bears and have studied climate change during the Pleistocene. According to the museum, the presumed flute has been associated with the end of the Middle Pleistocene and the time of Neanderthals about 55,000 years ago. This is not the only such site in Slovenia. In the 1920s and the 1930s, the archaeologist Srečko Brodar discovered tens of bones with holes in another site in the eastern Kravankne, but almost all of them were destroyed during the Italian occupation in Libya in World War II. So it's not just the didgeridoo that is a flute. There were lots of other flutes that were found of a similar nature, but they were actually all destroyed in World War II. The hole spacing and alignment. The probability that 4 randomly placed holes would appear in a line in recognisable musical scale is on the order of a few in several million. So the chances of another random event producing these holes that are on exact par with how you would have to place holes for the standard 7-note scale in the Western world, then the chances of that are a few in a few million. So something similar to winning the lottery. According to an analysis made in 2000 by Canadian musicologist Bob Fink, responding to D'Errico's carnivore origin hypothesis. That's the fancy term for the hypothesis that a hyena came along and bit into that bone. He pointed out that the features common between the carnivore origin artifact and other chewed bones studied by D'Errico do not include the alignment of the holes. So he's saying the guy who's saying that it's just a hyena who's came along and bit into this bone, he's saying this guy cannot be thinking about how these holes are aligned, because these holes are aligned perfectly with the 7-note Western scale. There is also no evidence that the 2 holes could have been bitten at the same time. The tooth spans were analysed by all taphonomists concerned to see if any animals could bite 2 or more such holes at once. No match could be found to any known animal. If a match had been found, it could have been cited as a prima facie evidence that the holes were animal made. This was noted by Turk. That's the man who is proposing that it is a flute. Turk is the man who's proposing that it is a flute, and D'Errico is the man who's proposing that it was an animal who bit into it. But this guy is saying there is no match for any animal's skull that could have made all of these holes at once, and that is how it would have had to have happened if it was an animal that made it. In his monograph, and was also noted for the opposing hypothesis, holders Newell and Chase, in their article in the August 98 issue of Current Anthropology, holes in the specimen, wrote Newell, were almost certainly made sequentially rather than simultaneously, and that the distance between them has nothing to do with the distance between any 2 teeth in a wolf's jaw. So there are several people who are coming along and analysing this. Only D'Errico is saying that it was an animal who bit into it and made it, but several people are corroborating the original guy's estimation the man Turk, and he's saying there is no way that if it was an animal that made it, all of the holes would have had to have been made at the same time. And he's saying the evidence shows that holes weren't made at the same time, and not only that, but the way the holes are positioned don't correspond to the jaw of any animal. The diatonic scale. Bog Fink claimed in his essay in 97 that the bones holes were consistent with 4 notes of the diatonic scale do, re, mi, fa, based on the spacing of these 4 holes. The spacing of the holes on a modern diatonic flute, the minor scale, are unique and not evenly spaced. In essence, Fink said they are like a simple fingerprint. The Divji baby bones holes matched those spacings very closely to a series of note holes in a minor scale. So when you're making the minor scale do, re, mi, fa, the holes aren't spaced uniformly. The holes have to be spaced in a specific manner, and the Divji baby matches that exactly. And as you can see here, there's evidence that there was a hole there, there's evidence that there was a hole there, we've got these 2 holes here. There's also evidence that there was a hole on the back which would have corresponded to holding it with a 5 fingers, and you can see how precise it has to be for it to be a flute, and the Divji baby matches that exactly. But we're having a revisionist history of negative scientists who want to go back and have a revisionist history because it's threatening to their evolution theory that man was so advanced at such an early time. So another thing that I want to get into is, I've been saying a lot about man. One of the things that I would like to just talk about for a couple of minutes is, I think that some of the ideals that are coming out of feminism are based on this ideal that has been promoted through the evolution theory and by extension into culture itself, that women have always been under the heel of men. There's a prevailing kind of cultural story, ancient cultural story of the caveman bossing his women about, dragging his women about, getting him to make his dinner for him, etc, etc. But I think that is a complete fallacy. It's completely untrue and it's completely wrong, and I think that that has then, women have been made to feel like that they have been subjected to men's needs and men's physical power through the full history of time. But I'm saying that's not accurate, and what I'm saying is that during the time of the Neanderthal, it was probably actually fairer for women, and women would have been held in esteem because they were the people who reproduced the society. They were the people who had children, and having children would have been very important to societies then. And I just simply do not believe this ideal that women were dragged around by the hair and something like that. I think that's all totally fake and it's nonsense. What I'm going to go on to say here is that, again, I've been talking a lot about men and what men have done. What I'm saying is that women who had children during that time period of the world without the ability of advanced medicine, I think that that is the greatest achievement in human history. The greatest achievement of any humans is the women who had children during that time period of the world, because having children now is actually still a very difficult thing to do. So if you can imagine that you were having children in a time when modern medicine didn't exist, that must have been a very scary thing, and it was a very, very brave thing to do. So evolutionists or the modern society won't talk about this great achievement that was done a long time ago, and I think it's because they don't really want people to think about how difficult it must have been for so-called Neanderthal man, for want of a better phrase, to produce families, the ancient family unit that I'm saying was all modern human beings. And I just think only modern human beings could have the intelligence, the bravery, the wherewithal to produce successful families in such a harsh environment. So I'll show you some pictures of how women had children back in those days, which I consider to be the greatest achievement of all human history. Back in the days, it seems that all the representations are that women gave birth in a squatted down position, and sometimes up against the back of another woman. There's another image there of ancient depiction of childbirth with the woman squatted down. There's another depiction of ancient childbirth with the woman in the squatting position and another 2 women helping. There's another depiction of childbirth again, and a woman in a squatted position. But what I'm trying to say is that I think also men would have been important during the childbirth at that time, and I think that when they teach us about Neanderthals or tell us about Neanderthals, the supposition is that women were slaves to men, but I think during the time period of childbirth, I think men would have been much more involved then. They would have been very, very worried about their partners dying during childbirth. They would have been very, very worried about their children dying during childbirth. And I think that the men would have been much more involved, they would have been much more caring, they would have been much more wary in helping their wife during that time period. And it might have been a community thing, it might have been other women that came in and helped, but I think that men would have stepped up and would have wanted their partner to have all of the things around them that were necessary to have a successful family. And if you think that when we look back, and I was telling you that the population went down from 10 million to 5 million within 1,000 years because of the rise in sea levels, and I'm also saying that humans are a part of infinity, and that the people who lived like 3.5 million years ago or 4 million years ago were probably people who survived a massive extinction event then also, and that lots of humans died out. So if you had seen lots of humans dying out, other children, bringing more children into the world would have been the most important thing that you could possibly do. If you were a human being who had witnessed a mass extinction event, bringing more children into the world would have been the most important thing that you could possibly do. And obviously these people understood that that was the most important thing that you can do, and they obviously did it successfully, and they obviously did it well, because we are all here now, and those people came through that very, very difficult time period. And I'm saying that the women are the heroes of that time period, but men also, I think, would have supplemented the care for the females and done the hunting and made the lifestyle worth living, but that the women are the genuine heroes of that time period. And obviously, so what I'm saying is that women would have probably have been on a pedestal during that time period, not subjected to men's needs and men's wants. I don't think that would have been the case. I think that women would have actually have been on a pedestal because they had an inherent value that they could actually produce children. Whereas a man's life would have had no inherent value. He would have been expected to go out and put his life on the line for his family, for the survival of his species, and rightfully so, and those people were right and they done everything correctly, otherwise we wouldn't be here now. So were the women during that time period of the world, was it a greater achievement than the ancient Olympians? Yes it was. And were the women who lived and had children during that time period to repopulate the world after the extinction events, was that a greater achievement than the Spartans? 300 Spartans holding back 250,000 Persians at the gates of Thermopylae? Yes, it is. It is a greater achievement than that. Was women having children during the primal years of man a greater achievement than the Magna Carta? Yes it was, because no one would exist if those people didn't do what needed to be done. Was women having children during the distant eras of man greater than Alexander the Great and the empire that he built? Yes it was. And was women having children during the repopulation period of man millions of years ago, was that a greater achievement than what Genghis Khan done and the Mongol Empire? Yes, it was. It wasn't cooler, because no one's cooler than Genghis Khan, but it was a greater achievement, because if those women didn't have children, no one on this planet would exist. And if the men didn't provide for their women and put their women up on a pedestal, no one on this planet would exist. So anyway, let's get on to now to show you what actual scientists are saying. This is the final few slides we're coming into now. So this is what science is actually saying. You've heard what I've said. I've said that humans are a part of infinity. They've survived several extinction events throughout the years. Modern humans go back millions and millions of years. I'm saying that modern humans go back into infinity. But the only evidence that we have actually found is from humans a few million years old. Science is saying that modern humans didn't exist until 200,000 years ago. The Neanderthal Man, for one reason or another, existed until 40,000 years ago, but the mainstay of science is trying to say that there's a sequential linear order of man stepping down from the trees, from being a monkey to then becoming slightly more advanced, going through several stages of being completely different species before he could become the modern human. But I'm not saying that. I'm saying that any era of man has existed, has always been a modern human, a behaviourally modern person. So the Neanderthal Genome Project is one thing that evolutionists would use to say that Neanderthals were different to humans. So the Neanderthal Genome Project is an effort of a group of scientists to sequence the Neanderthal genome. In December 2013, scientists reported for the first time a high-coverage genome of a Neanderthal. The genome was extracted from the bone fragment of a Neanderthal female from around 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, found in a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. According to preliminary sequences, 99.7% of those base pairs of the modern human and Neanderthal genomes are identical, compared to humans sharing around 98.8% of base pairs with the chimpanzee. Other studies concerning the commonality between chimps and humans have modified the commonality of 99% to a commonality of 94%, showing that the genetic gap between humans and chimps is far larger than originally thought. So that counts into what I'm saying. There's all the trends and the evidence that are coming out now are actually disproving the evolution theory on a large scale, but you're not really getting to hear about it, and if you are getting to hear about it, it's reported in such a way that it would seem normal. So they're now saying that humans aren't as similar to chimpanzees as they originally thought. The researchers recovered ancient DNA of Neanderthals by extracting the DNA from the femur bones of 3 38,000-year-old female Neanderthal specimens from a cave in Croatia and other bones found in Spain, Russia and Germany. Only about half a gram of the bone samples was required for the sequencing, but the project faced many difficulties, including the contamination of the samples by the bacteria that had colonised the Neanderthal's body and humans who handled the bones at the excavation site and at the laboratory. So I just want to talk about the sequencing and this idea about things matching to a high percentage, right? See if you compared the genes, if you sequenced the genes of an African man and a Chinese man, their genome sequence would not match 100%. Now does that mean that either one of them is not human? If you sequence the genome of an Aborigine and the genome of an Inuit, their genomes would not match 100%. Now does that mean that either one of them is not human? And if you sequence the genome of a white, ginger, European man, and then you sequence the genome of an African pygmy, their genomes would not match 100%, but it doesn't mean that either one of them is not human. So when they're talking about Neanderthal genomes being different to human genomes, that is because they were adapted to living during the Ice Age, and although one species can't change to another species, there is a variable range within all species. It's actually called DNA switches. Certain switches within a genome can be turned on or turned off, and they're actually finding that these switches are far more important than DNA itself. It's like DNA is the computer board or the central processor, but the DNA switches decides what is going to be turned on and what is going to be turned off. And Neanderthals were human beings. They weren't a subspecies or a different species, they were just human beings who had different DNA switches turned on to adapt to a different environment. So I'll quickly show you that now. The actual detail of it is far too expansive to get into, but DNA switches, okay, so genes make up only 2% of the human genome and were easy to spot, but the on-off switches controlling these genes were encrypted within the remaining 98% of the genome. Without these switches, called regulatory DNA, genes are inert. So the Neanderthal man just simply had different sets of genes switched on and switched off compared to us, the human beings who live now. But it doesn't mean that they are not human or we're not human. We're both human, and we might not match 100%, but the actual significance of that is not of great significance at all. And that's how different humans can be. So let's get into it again. In 2006, two research teams working on the same Neanderthal sample published their results, Richard Green and his team in Nature and Noonan's team in Science. The results were received with criticism, mainly surrounding the issue of a possible admixture of Neanderthals into the modern human genome. The speech-related gene FOXP2 with the same mutations as in modern humans was discovered in ancient DNA in the L. Sidron specimens, suggesting Neanderthals might have shared some basic language capabilities with modern humans. So the Neanderthal genome sequencing thing is actually coming in for a lot of criticism, talking about corruption of the samples that were used. In 2006, Richard Green's team had used a then new sequencing technique developed by Life Sciences that amplifies single molecules for characterization and obtained over 250,000 unique short sequences. The technique delivers randomly located reads so that sequences of interest, e.g. genes that differ between humans and Neanderthal, show up at random as well. However, this form of direct sequencing destroys the original sample, so to obtain new reads, more samples must be destructively sequenced, so it's not a very good process. Noonan's team, led by Edward Rubin, used a different technique, one in which the Neanderthal DNA is inserted into the bacteria, which make multiple copies of a single fragment. They demonstrated that Neanderthal genomic sequences can be recovered using a metagenomic library-based approach. All of the DNA in the sample is immortalized into metagenomic libraries. A DNA fragment is selected, then propagated in microbes. The Neanderthal DNA can be sequenced, or specific sequences can be studied. Overall, the results were remarkably similar. One group suggested that there was a hint of mixing between human and Neanderthal genomes, while the other found none, but both teams recognised that the dataset was not large enough to give a definitive answer. So there's a couple of things going on there. First of all, they say the results were remarkably similar, but then in the very next sentence they're saying one team suggested that there was mixing between human and Neanderthal genomes, and the other team found that there was no mixing. So that's a massive difference. I think maybe what they're suggesting is that there was interbreeding between humans, so-called humans, and so-called Neanderthals. Now, unfortunately, if you can have sex with something and have a child with it, it means that you're the same species. That's what it means. So Neanderthals were human and modern humans were human. If you can have sex and create a child, then that means that you are the same species. But even at that, even although they disagreed on that, both of them agreed that the data is not large enough to give a definitive answer. So it just goes to show how far they're willing to push it to try and find out about evolution. They're basing a lot of what evolution says is based on things that haven't even been proven. The publication by Noonan and his team revealed Neanderthal DNA sequences matching chimpanzee DNA but not modern human DNA at multiple locations, thus enabling the first accurate calculation of the date of the most recent common ancestor. But not modern human DNA at multiple locations, thus enabling the first accurate calculation of the date of the most recent common ancestor of Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthals. The research team estimates the most recent common ancestor of the Homo neanderthals samples and their Homo sapiens reference sequence lived 706,000 years ago, estimating the separation of the human and Neanderthal ancestral population to 370,000 years ago. But as I've showed you at the start of these slides, there's examples of modern humans living 3.5 million years ago. So they didn't split then because humans were already in the world. Earlier mitochondrial DNA research led by geneticist Savante Pabo in 1997 had indicated present-day Homo sapiens and Neanderthals DNA split into separate lineages approximately 500,000 years ago. Green calculated a divergence time of 516,000 years ago and do not indicate a split, while they claim the average divergence time between alleles within humans is 459,000 years ago, with a 95% confidence interval between 420 and 498,000 years ago. These dates were calculated with assumption on non-selective pressure. If positive selection forced DNA changes, then the split time may be shorter. In this study, the team stated Neanderthal genetic differences to humans must therefore be interpreted within the context of human diversity. So it seems they're setting up this whole experiment to prove that Neanderthals are a different species to humans, but then when they're actually talking about narrowing it down and summarising the whole entire experiment, they're saying that the differences between humans and Neanderthals are within the context of human diversity. So it basically means that they're saying that both Neanderthals and humans are humans, which is totally contradictory. You don't need to have a separate name for species that are the same. On the other hand, Noonan found no evidence of Neanderthal admixture to the modern human genome, but they did not preclude admixture of up to 20% with a certainty better than 95%, and hence did not claim to present a definitive answer to the question. So that's them talking about Neanderthals and humans breeding. They're saying that Noonan and his team didn't find evidence of that, but they claim that you can't actually answer that question. And that is something that has become a kind of commonly accepted fact, that humans and Neanderthals supposedly did breed together. That has become something that is so widely reported as fact that it has become fact in the common knowledge. But the actual study that was done to prove it eitherwise, there was only two teams. One team said it did happen and one team said it didn't happen, but both teams admitted that you can't actually say for sure. And it's a bit of a contradictory study to set up in the first place, because if two different animals can have sex and produce a child, then it means that they're the same species anyway. In February 2009, the Max Planck Institute's team, led by Pablo, announced that they had completed the first draft of the Neanderthal genome. An early analysis of the data suggested in the genome of Neanderthals, a human species driven to extinction, no significant trace of Neanderthal genes in modern humans. So they're referring to Neanderthals as humans, and they're saying that humans don't have any Neanderthal genes in them. But I'm saying that's all very confusing, it's all a load of rubbish. All it is that humans have lived for infinity. Pretty much all the animals on Earth have lived for infinity. The bacteria, the grass, the flora, the fauna, the microbes, all of the animals on this earth have lived for infinity, and Neanderthals are just a species of human who had adapted, their DNA switches had adapted them for a life of survival in an ice age climate. And I think that makes far more sense than all of this fluff that they are trying to go about doing. It doesn't actually matter if humans and Neanderthals interbred, because they're both humans. In May 2010, the project released a draft of their report on the sequenced Neanderthal genome, contradicting the results discovered while examining mitochondrial DNA. They demonstrated a range of genetic contribution to non-African modern humans ranging from 1% to 4% from their Homo sapiens samples in Eurasia. The authors state that it is likely that interbreeding occurred in the Levant before Homo sapiens migrated into Europe. However, this finding is disputed because of the paucity of archaeological evidence supporting their statement. The fossil evidence does not conclusively place Neanderthals and modern humans in close proximity at this time and place. So what this computer model study showed them, biological study showed them, is that probably Africans and Neanderthals interbred in the Levant, but they can't actually prove that either way because there's no archaeological evidence to support it. And I'm saying that all humans are humans, including Neanderthals, and perhaps some of the reason that it's showing up that our genes are similar to their genes is because we have the same genetic code, and we might have certain DNA switches that are turned on or off that are similar to theirs, but at the end of the day we're both human, and this is all just looking into the minutiae of something to prove something that isn't there. Previously in 1999 a report was made of a rib fragment from the partial skeleton of a Neanderthal infant found in the Mesomaskaya cave in the northwestern foothills of the Caucasus Mountains that was radiocarbon dated to 30,000 years ago and therefore belonging to the latest lived Neanderthals. Ancient DNA was recovered for a mitochondrial DNA sequence showing that 3.5% divergence from that of the Feldhofer Neanderthal some 2,500 kilometres to the west in Germany. Phylogenetic analysis placed the two in a clade distinct from modern humans, suggesting that their mitochondrial DNA types have not contributed to the modern human mitochondrial DNA pool. So it sounds like they've found the DNA of a supposed Neanderthal lad, and his DNA was 3.5% different to other Neanderthals that they found only 2,500 metres away from him. And taking into account both of those so-called Neanderthals genes, they found that they're concluding that humans didn't interbreed with Neanderthals, but for some strange reason in the modern world, in the textbooks and in the common knowledge, it is well regarded and well accepted that Neanderthals and humans did interbreed. But what I'm saying is that it's all fluff, it's all a load of shite that's not worth bothering about, because we are all humans. The Neanderthals were humans and we are humans. Okay, so this is archaic human admixture with modern humans. There have been arguments in favour of archaic human admixture with modern humans through interbreeding of modern humans with Neanderthals, Denisovians and or possibly other archaic humans over the course of human history. Neanderthal derived DNA accounts for an estimated 1 to 4% of the Eurasian genome, but is significantly absent or uncommon in the genome of most sub-Saharan African people, and in my opinion that can be explained by the fact that probably people in the sub-Saharan Africa have never lived through an ice age period, whereas the people of Eurasia have, so they have different DNA switches that have been turned on or turned off, and therefore their genome is a bit different, but they're both human. The Africans are humans, the Eurasians are humans, and the Neanderthals are humans. In Oceanian and Southeast Asian populations, there is a relative increase of Denisovian-derived DNA. An estimated 4 to 6% of the Melanesian genome is derived from Denisovians. Recent non-comparative DNA analysis, as no specimens have been discovered, suggests that African populations have a genetic contribution from a now extinct archaic African hominin population. Again, that feeds into what I'm saying. There's always been humans on the earth, no matter how far back you look. We are part of infinity. There was probably extinction events in Africa that led for African people to die out in great number, but there was humans before them. There's been extinction events in Europe, there have been extinction events in Australia and Polynesia, and all the people have died out, and their ancestors might have had different DNA switches, but we are all human and we have all had a human genome. There's also evidence that in the distant past the Earth had more oxygen on it, it had more plants, it had more animals, so therefore it makes sense that the human genome was capable of adapting to a range of environments, and the reason for the 1 to 4% or the slight different percentages is because they're all human, but they were all adapted to varying degrees of the environment, and it was all capable within the genome from the start. Nevertheless, there are still some doubts about the recent admixture events among a number of researchers. Ancient subpopulation structure ancestral to modern humans, Neanderthals, Denisovans and other possible archaic humans has been proposed as an alternative explanation for the observed genetic similarities. So I think that's exactly what I'm saying. They're saying that the fall down in their theory is that it could just be the ancient subpopulations have observed genetic similarities with us, and that we're all humans. Through whole genome sequencing, a 2010 draft sequence of the Neanderthal genome revealed that Neanderthals shared more alleles with Eurasian populations than with sub-Saharan African populations, because there was a recent ice age in Europe, but there hasn't been a recent ice age in Africa. According to the study, the observed excess of genetic similarity is best explained by recent gene flow from Neanderthals to modern humans after the migration out of Africa. The proportion of Neanderthal-derived ancestry was estimated to be 1 to 4% of the Eurasian genome. In 2013, the same team of researchers revised the proportion to an estimated 1.5 to 2.1%. So again, the trends are showing that they're having to change their theories and their original estimations because they're always wrong. 1.5 to 2.1% is absolutely nothing. As I was saying previously, I bet if you sequence the genome of an African pygmy compared to a Scottish guy with ginger hair, you would probably get the difference of 1.5 to 2.1%, but all of them are human anyway. Recent studies have shown a higher Neanderthal admixture in East Asians than in Europeans, but there was an ice age in East Asia as well. In the recent times, it indicated that most likely at least 2 independent events of gene flow must have taken place into early modern humans, and that the early ancestors of East Asians experienced more admixture than those of Europeans. No evidence of Neanderthal mitochondrial DNA has been found in modern humans. This would suggest the successful admixture with Neanderthals happened paternally rather than maternally on the side of Neanderthals. Possible hypotheses are that Neanderthal DNA had detrimental mutations that led to the extinction of carriers, that the hybrid offspring of Neanderthal mothers were raised in Neanderthal groups and became extinct with them, or that female Neanderthals and male sapiens did not produce fertile offspring. So that's a possibility, but we'll never know. What I'm saying is that the Neanderthals were humans adapted to the Ice Age, and as the Ice Age receded, the need for the Neanderthal genes also receded, and it's likely that those people probably found it hard to survive in a different environment, and the women were maybe choosing to mate with people who were more adapted to warmer climates. And in a lot of ways that makes sense, because if a Neanderthal had a stockier body and a broader nose and a bigger head, part of beauty is symmetry, and I would say that probably if you're adapted to a warmer climate, you probably have more symmetry on your face compared to someone with a big head, a big nose. So it kind of makes sense that over time females are going to mate with who they want to mate with, attractive males, and the attractive males would have been the ones who didn't have Neanderthal-esque features, but Neanderthals were still human beings. And so it could be that the need for the human beings who were adapted to the Ice Age was no longer there, and those people either found it hard to live in the environment that was a warmer climate. So again, there's another reason for females not to mate with those people, because they were perhaps giving their offspring detrimental traits that they didn't want anymore. Recent studies found the presence of large genomic regions with strongly reduced Neanderthal contribution in modern humans due to negative selection, partly caused by hybrid male infertility. But there's no proof for that. It is a possibility. It has been shown that Neanderthal ancestry has been selected against in conserved biological pathways such as RNA processing. So that's exactly what I'm saying, that the DNA switches are turning off. That's another possibility actually that I didn't mention, is that simply humans did continue to have children with whoever was around, not part of a selection process as I previously mentioned, but just that simply the genome itself, the RNA processing within the genome, switched off the old genome switches and went to new ones, and that's why the genome is a bit different. Genes affecting keratin were found to have been introgressed from Neanderthals into modern humans, suggesting that these genes have a morphological adaptation in skin and hair to modern humans to cope with non-African environments. This is likewise for several genes. So it's saying that the main differences, the actual genes, the main differences between modern humans and Neanderthals is adaptations in skin and hair, which again is also can be completely explained by having lived through an ice age. According to a study in 2012, the extinction of Neanderthals may even be attributed to African ancestors of Eurasians interbreeding with the Middle Eastern Neanderthal, although one hypothesis is that brutish hominins were simply no match Well, in fact, let me go back and analyse that. If they're saying that the extinction of the Neanderthal was because Africans were breeding with Neanderthals, but in the previous slide they were saying that Neanderthals produced children that were infertile when they mated with modern humans, so they seem to be a bit confused on that one. Although one hypothesis is that the British hominins were simply no match for cultured, intelligent Homo sapiens and quickly went extinct, there is some evidence shown in the 2012 study that interbreeding may have caused the Neanderthal to go extinct simply due to the random mixing of their genes through sexual reproduction. So that's what I'm saying, that Neanderthals were humans, the Ice Age died out, people who lived in warmer climates probably started moving up into areas that they hadn't lived before, everyone was having sex and reproducing, and the human genome then, through a process of interbreeding and just simply the genome adapting to a warmer climate, the DNA switches turned off the old switches. The model produced by Neves and Service suggests that the 1 to 4% genetic mix present in the Eurasian genome could have come about with one interbreeding every 10 to 80 generations. These low rates of interbreeding could theoretically have led to the extinction of Neanderthals through a genetic lottery. So what is genomic imprinting? What is a genomic imprint? How does genomic imprinting take place? I think this is just a more distinct explanation of DNA switches. If I say that this allele is maternally imprinted, does it mean that the allele of the gene is passed only by the mother? If a pedigree is given, how can we identify whether the trait is paternally imprinted or maternally imprinted? Please try to explain this simply as possible. Genomic imprinting is an epigenetic mechanism of inheritance which allows genes to be expressed differently depending on which parent they come from. This means it is modification of the genome or changes what the genome produces without changing the nucleotide DNA sequence. The result of imprinting in diploid organisms is that one of the two alleles is silenced. Okay, so you can end up having silenced genomes through interbreeding and DNA switches. Hans-Peter Steensby in the 1907 article Race Studies in Denmark rejected that Neanderthals were ape-like or inferior, and while emphasising that all modern humans are of mixed origins, suggested interbreeding as the best available explanation of a significant number of observations which by then were available. And Denisovians, that's the people who were more related to Aborigines, and I've shown you in previous slides how advanced they were. A 2010 study has shown that Melanesians, Papua New Guineans and Bougainville Islanders share relatively more alleles with Denisovians when compared to other of the studied Eurasians and Africans. It estimated that 4 to 6% of the genome in Melanesians derives from Denisovians, while no other Eurasians or Africans displayed contributions to the Denisovian genes. It has been observed that Denisovians contributed genes to Melanesians but not to East Asians, indicating that there was interaction between the early ancestors of Melanesians with Denisovians, but this interaction did not take place in the regions near southern Siberia, where as of yet the only Denisovian remains have been found. In addition, a 2011 study has also shown a relative increased allele sharing between Denisovians and Aborigine Australians compared to other Eurasians and African populations, consistent with relative high admixture between early ancestors of Melanesians and Denisovians. So let me explain to you how that falls in exactly with what I'm saying. I'm saying that Neanderthals, so-called Neanderthals, were humans. They were adapted to the Ice Age. The Ice Age was in North America, Canada, Europe and East Asia. That's where the Ice Age was. They're saying that Eurasians and East Asians have 1 to 4% genes that were similar to the Neanderthal genome, but I'm saying that all that is there was humans living in those parts of the world. As time went on, the climate got warmer, the Ice Age receded, the DNA switches that had been turned on to adapt man to the Ice Age were no longer needed, so the DNA switches then changed, and that can also happen through interbreeding. So maybe perhaps people in southern Europe, there were people living in northern Europe and northern East Asia who were adapted to the Ice Age, and there were people further down from that who weren't adapted to the Ice Age. Then they started interbreeding with each other as the climate warmed, and the need for the Neanderthal, the need for the genes which adapted man to the Ice Age was no longer needed, so then through natural selection those genes gradually died out, but not completely. The Denisovians are just simply the pre-Aborigine and pre-Melanesian people. So what I'm saying is that humans go back into infinity. There was modern humans in Europe before the Neanderthal, there were modern humans in Africa millions of years ago, there were modern humans in Australia millions of years ago. The modern humans who lived in Europe were the only people who had to change their DNA to adapt to the environment, and again through natural selection there might have been people who were adapted to warmer climates, but they died out because they couldn't adapt to the Ice Age. And there was extinction events as well, so the only humans who were living in northern Europe at that time, through natural selection, the prominent males were people who were adapted, who did have genes and DNA switching that was more naturally geared towards cold survival. So then that became the dominant population, but then as cold survival was not necessary anymore, it receded, and the warmer climate people became the dominant genes, the dominant part of the gene pool, and that's explained by natural selection. But it doesn't mean that a human can give birth to anything other than a human. All of these are examples of humans. The Aborigines don't have any examples of DNA that required them to adapt to a cold environment because they don't live in a cold environment and they didn't need to adapt to that. And their ancestors, the Denisovians, are examples of pre-Oceanic people. The Neanderthals are examples of pre-European people and Asian people, and the Africans, there isn't examples of pre-African peoples. The African peoples are the ones who we have examples of going farthest back into the past, modern humans 3.5 million years ago, and that falls in with exactly what I'm saying, that humans have always been on the planet. There has always been forms of humans. They might have been adapted to slightly different environments, but they have always been humans. The Denisovians are the ancestors of the Aborigines and the Polynesian peoples. The Neanderthals, so-called Neanderthal, that wasn't a different species, it was a human, as the pre-peoples of Europe and Asia. And the Africans, they go as far back into history as you can imagine. And the only people who have so-called Neanderthal DNA are the people whose ancestors were adapted to a cold climate. A 2014 study found that the EPAS1 gene variant was introduced from Denisovians to modern humans. The ancestral variant upregulates hemoglobin levels to compensate for low oxygen levels, such as at high altitudes, but this also has the maladaptation of increasing blood viscosity. The Denisovian-derived variant, on the other hand, limits the increase of hemoglobin levels, thus resulting in a better altitude adaptation. The Denisovian-derived gene variant is common in Tibetans and was positively selected in their ancestors after they colonised the Tibetan plateau. So the Denisovians and the Aborigines are different from us. Their genes are more adapted for living in high altitudes, and as we're seeing here, you don't get a positive without getting a negative. So because they're adapted to higher oxygen, but they have increased blood viscosity. So again, that isn't an example of evolution. If every time that something positive happens, something negative is also happening, it doesn't mean that you can go from one animal to another animal in sequential order and in increasing complexity. In 2011, a study produced evidence that the highest presence of Denisovian admixture is in Oceanian populations, followed by many Southeast Asian populations and none in East Asian populations. There is significant Denisovian genetic material in Eastern, Southeast Asian and Oceanian populations, but not in Western and continental Southeast Asian populations, indicating that the Denisovian admixture event happened in Southeast Asia itself rather than in mainland Eurasia. The observation of high Denisovian admixture in Oceania Siberia and the lack thereof in mainland Asia suggests that early modern humans and Denisovians had interbred east of the Wallace Line that divides Southeast Asia. And even although the only examples of Denisovian remains that they have, they're saying, is in Siberia, I did also explain in previous slides that the Aborigines are the ones who in ancient times spanned the globe in their rafts very, very well. So it's not completely out of the question that they would have been in Siberia. Findings indicate that the Denisovian gene flow event happened to the common ancestors of Aboriginal Filipinos, Australians and New Guineans. New Guineans and Australians have similar rates of Denisovian admixture, indicating that the interbreeding took place prior to their common ancestors' entry into Sahul, Pleistocene New Guinea and Australia at least 44,000 years ago. It has also been observed that the fraction of near Oceanian ancestry in Southeast Asian populations is proportional to the Denisovian admixture, except in the Philippines where there is a higher proportional Denisovian admixture to near Oceanian ancestry. Rich et al. In 2010 suggested a possible model of an early eastward migration wave of modern humans, some who were Philippine, New Guinean and Australian common ancestors that interbred with Denisovians, respectively, followed by divergence of the Philippine early ancestors, interbreeding between the New Guinean and Australian early ancestors with a part of the same early migration population that did not experience Denisovian gene flow, and interbreeding between the Philippine early ancestors with a part of the population from a much later eastward migration wave, the other part of which would become East Asians. So that's kind of like basically just saying that there were maybe 2 or 3 kind of events going on, but the long and the short of it is that the Denisovians were the pre-people, and the Denisovians passed their genes on to the Philippines, the New Guineans and the Australians, and the Philippines and the New Guineans and the Australians then interbred with some Southeast Asian people, and then that kind of created a new type of people. So all of those people have the same kind of genetics going back into ancestry, but the East Asians don't. So it's just another kind of longer and complicated way of explaining what it is that I'm trying to say, that East Asians and Europeans have Neanderthal DNA because their ancestors lived through an ice age, and that ice age might have lasted a few hundred years. So because of natural selection, the people who survived the cold event, I'm saying they came from a human species. Neanderthals came from a human species who lived before them, but when the cold came in, the only people who survived were people who had genetics that were predisposed to surviving cold survival. The DNA switches that they had, then they passed that on to their children, and it became more and more pronounced as they lived for a few hundred years in the ice age. So it became their genes became more and more pronounced. Then that ice age finished, and the other peoples around the world, and remember the population at various times has been much smaller than it is now. So when the tribes of the world during these hundreds and hundreds of years, because there has been no extinction events that we can say since that ice age, there hasn't been any extinction events since then, the world population has only increased and increased. So as the population increases during those few hundred years or however long that ice age lasted, the southern European peoples, the Africans, the other peoples of the world, their populations would have increased. The Neanderthal populations would have increased as well as they survived their extinction. Their extinction event would have been the ice age coming in. The pre-peoples of the Neanderthal, their extinction event would have been the ice age coming in. Then they survived, then they stabilised, then their populations increased. The southern European peoples and the Africans and the Polynesians, etc. that I'm saying, their populations would have only increased during that time because there was no extinction event. So as the populations increased, they had much greater chance of finding each other and meeting each other. As they then found each other and met each other, and the Laurentide ice sheet receded, that caused extinction events in Polynesia, New Guinea and other places around the world because their water levels rose, and it would have erased the coastal peoples of that time, because people would have been living on the coast and they wouldn't have expected that. Then that would have destroyed their homes and the livelihoods that they were used to living. But as the southern Europeans started breeding with the people who had pronounced Neanderthal genomes, people who had pronounced genomes that were used for cold survival, they would have started then interbreeding with the southern Europeans, and the people in East Asia then would have started breeding with the other Asians that didn't have the pronounced Neanderthal genes, and then that would have then meant that the gene pool became more mixed and more varied. The Neanderthal genome wasn't necessary anymore, and that is why this slide here is just a long explanation basically of saying that the pre-people of the Polynesians or Denisovians, they were adapted to living in high altitudes. The pre-people of the Europeans and the Asians, they were adapted to living in a cold environment. The Africans, it seems, maybe perhaps don't have a specific adaptation for the types of environments that I'm talking about. They do obviously have a specific adaptation for lasting the most hottest environments on Earth. They've got the genome for that. So the East Asians and the Europeans have genetics going back that is relating to the Neanderthal, because our ancestors were adapted to a cold environment. The Polynesians, the New Guineans, the Australians, they don't really have that because their ancestors were adapted to living in high altitudes, and the Africans have got the African genome, which I'm not exactly sure at this moment in time what their survival is specifically related to, but they are fantastic survivors and their ancestry goes furthest back into the past. So they're going to all this bother to explain the different genomes, but they're not really sure what it means, and they're not really coming to any kind of massive conclusions on it. But the story that I have told is not out of sync with science, and it's actually completely in line with science, and the story that I am putting across is exactly in line with science. And science isn't really coming to a specific part of the story. Science is just looking for ways to say that the ancient man was regressed, and they want to say that the ancient man was regressed because that suits their evolution model. So as actually time has went on, this is the type of drawings and things, the type of depictions that you would have got of the Neanderthal man in the past, say at the start of the 20th century. This is the type of thing that they would have said, because evolutionists and scientists want there to be a regressed form of man that they can say, look, see, there was a gradual upgrade of man in human genetics, but I'm saying that isn't the case. Humans have always been humans. Neanderthals is just a word that is incorrectly used to describe humans who had pronounced genetics that were used to survive a cold climate. As time has went on, science has went on, it has had to continually upgrade its notion of what a Neanderthal was without basically having the guts to admit that they were wrong from the start. It hasn't done that. It hasn't said, right, okay, so Neanderthals have exhibited all aspects of behavioural modernity, so we are now going to have to change what we see the Neanderthal man as. Science has never been honest enough to describe that, and so this is the type of past that we're looking to. It suited their agenda and it suited their story to say that the Neanderthal man was completely regressed and perhaps only one, a few tens of generations, a few hundreds of generations away from monkeys, literally monkeys, but they have continually had to upgrade as they've found more evidence about what the Neanderthal man could do and what the Neanderthal man did, for lack of a better phrase. He wasn't a Neanderthal, he was just a human. They have had to continually upgrade what the Neanderthal man could do, but they've never actually had the guts to describe, look, it's not a Neanderthal man anymore, it's not a separate species anymore. The only reason that they continue to push that agenda is in protectionism of the evolution theory. And there's a standard in science, and they work off of paradigms, and using paradigms, which would just mean their current best guess, their current best theory. Everyone assumes that current best theory is correct, because that is what allows them to continue moving forward and continue to ask questions about the physical world and develop science. Now, unfortunately, what's happened is there is an admittance that the current paradigm for man's origins and man's evolution has been proven wrong, and everyone in science knows that, but it has never really been announced in any specific way or promoted or advertised in an honest way because, as I was saying, the protectionism of the evolution theory. Because when they've looked into the past, the idea was that man came down from the trees because there was some type of extinction event that led the trees to be, there was a mass of trees in a jungle type environment, a thick Amazonian jungle type environment, but they've looked back, they can actually look back now and dissect the actual flora and fauna of the time that happened, because they expected, the reason that man would have came down from the trees is to then survive in an environment where the trees were decimated, and it was an environment that was more on the ground and surviving on the grasses and the plants and animals that were on the ground. But they've looked back at the biodiversity at that time and they have found that there was no event that led to a savanna environment. There was no such thing. So the thing that they say was the catalyst of man coming down from the trees, it never happened, and they know it never happened. But they continue to use that paradigm because it allows them to ask questions and continue on with the science, and that is their current best guess. So the thing about the Neanderthal man, again, that is a paradigm that they currently believe, that's their best guess. But as time is going on, the trends are showing that the Neanderthal man never existed, and it was a complex set of human beings who could do all the aspects of behavioural modernity. And if they could do all the aspects of behavioural modernity, which they could, then they were modern humans, no different to the people who live today. The only difference being that as time has went on and there has been no extinction events, man has found ways to record his knowledge and pass his knowledge on to a wider section of the world, and to pass his knowledge on to his ancestors a lot easier. And so in that sense, technology has advanced, but the actual human species has not. The human species has always been human, and it's false paradigms that are still being sold by science community. But maybe it's time that we allowed alternative theories to come through, and maybe it's time that people in science were honest and forthright and said that the Neanderthal man was a human being, he was behaviourally modern, he met all the standards of behavioural modernity, therefore he was human, and that pushes back the origins of man even further. If he was a modern human, for as far back as we look, human beings were always human beings, then the evolution theory has a big question to answer, because from what they say, it takes millions of years for something to evolve, and there would be a multiple number, dozens of intermediary species that would lead from man being a monkey up until man being a human being. But if every time that we look back into human beings and we find that they were always behaviourally modern, then it proves that there was no intermediary species, and that man has been fully formed with all the behavioural aspects and all the genetic aspects that we have now, but they were fully formed from the moment that man, from any evidence, as far back as we look, any evidence that we can find, man is always fully formed and always human and complex. Then there's a big question for evolution to answer there, because there are no intermediary species, and it disproves the idea that it would take millions of years for man to become fully complex and the fully modern human that we know of today. But the truth is that it always has been that modern species, and science is working off of false paradigms, but they know that they are, but the public perhaps don't. Look at this picture here. I mean, this picture here is, say, at the start of the 20th century. That is how they would have depicted the Neanderthal man. As I'm saying, the trends are showing us that the Neanderthal man was extremely complex. He had spiritualism, he had aspects of religion, he had aspects of studying the stars and the planets, he had farming, he had jewellery, he had art, he was domesticating species. These are all incredibly complex things, and what I'm saying is that this was the re-emergence of man after an extinction event. It wasn't the origins of man, it was the re-emergence of man. So unfortunately for me and what I'm saying, because I'm not backed up by science, well, I'm trying to say that I am by going through it all, but I feel like everything that I say will be non-validated in the eyes of the viewer. So I'm just going to quickly go through it, because when you start then questioning, if I'm saying that Neanderthals weren't human, that's one aspect, but for me to then say that that is a question over the evolution theory, that's another aspect. I have made other videos in which I question the narrative of the evolution theory. The evolution theory in science that the public know about is neo-Darwinism, and even in science, neo-Darwinism is very controversial. Lots of people don't accept the full aspects of neo-Darwinism, but the public doesn't know that. But the public do accept neo-Darwinism because that is what the scientific paradigm is. But lots of people in science, and including myself in the videos that I've made, I question neo-Darwinism, and so I feel like when I say things, people can just always fall back onto the safety blanket that is, well, science doesn't believe that, and I'm not qualified to say these things. But as I've pointed out to people previously, there are amateurs in astronomy who have made thousands of discoveries. I'm sure there are amateurs in other aspects of science that have made discoveries, and if it wasn't for the work of amateurs just studying things and doing it in their own time, giving up their own time to do it, then science wouldn't have been pushed forward as it is today. So I'm saying that even although I'm an amateur and I'm not qualified, that I am well studied in this area, and I feel like what I'm saying does have validity, but I feel like I've got to validate every single thing that I say. So I'm just going to show a couple of quick slides, because when you start questioning evolution and the genetics, there's a whole set of complex questions that come up, and then from the answers of that, if you answer that question, then another complex question can be raised from the answer. But I'll just quickly go through now to finalise off this video. But certainly, whether you believe in evolution or not, certainly the aspects of the Neanderthal man not being human and being a completely different species is a false paradigm. So this is what I'm talking about here. I made a slide to go through propositions, and then there's secondary questions that come up from the answers to the questions. So the proposition is man was never a Neanderthal, and the answer to that is that there are examples of anatomically modern humans going back officially as far as 3.5 million years ago. So why was the Neanderthal man different then? And that's because of genetic variety within the genome. Species have the ability to adapt to varied environments, and this is then expressed through natural selection, where species who are better at surviving within that particular subsect of the environment will become the dominant progenitors and pass their genes on through breeding. So the Neanderthal man was different because of natural selection, and he lived in a winter environment for a very long time. So if species can change through natural selection, does that not mean then that evolution must be true? The answer to that is actually no, because most variation is an example of a change within a species. If a bird gives birth to a bird that's got different coloured feathers, or a flower gives birth to a flower that's got different floral patterns, or if a human being gives birth to an intelligent human being, or they give birth to a human being who needs glasses, then those are all examples of changes within a species, and those changes can never lead to a new species being born, because with each generation it's a completely randomised version of the genetics. Sometimes mutations can skip a generation. The thing about the natural selection is that evolutionists will say, well, mutations occur and then that then leads to a new species, but what they don't tell you is that mutations are actually harmful to the genome. I think it's estimated that 99% of mutations are actually harmful to the survival of a species, not a plus. So you might get a human who's born who's strong, you might get a human who's born who's more intelligent than most other human beings, but again, that is never ever going to lead to a process where a human being could give birth to anything other than a human being. And the same goes for every single animal on Earth, or living organism for that matter. So what they don't say is that most of the mutations that are passed on from generation to generation are actually harmful, where if you required glasses, if you were colourblind, if you were born with a disability, all of these various things, these are all examples of mutations that are harmful. to the genome, and those mutations do not help people to survive in the wild, and that is what evolution is all about. It's about surviving in the wild. So if mutations that you are given would make it less able for you to survive in the wild, then that's not a process, that's not a successful process that will then produce a completely new animal. So why do we have examples of new animals then? And that's because some species can breed and create hybrids. However, in the natural world, this is very rare, and only a few species within the entire spectrum of all living organisms can actually produce hybrids, and most examples of new animals created from hybrids are in fact examples of man himself domesticating a species. I'm being a bit disingenuous there, because domesticating a species and a hybrid are actually two different things, but what happens is, if man has domesticated the auroch and he's made it into a cow, and if man has domesticated the cock and he's made it into a chicken, and if man has domesticated the boar and made it into the pig, unfortunately, as it goes with science, the pig, the cow, the chicken, and other examples of species that man has domesticated, the dog, are all actually examples of a narrowed gene pool. When you breed an animal and you breed it towards the purposes that you want, then it actually narrows the animal's genetic stock. It doesn't verify the genetic stock, and in the real world, genetic variation is more powerful than a narrow genetic stock. So what man has done with the animals that he has domesticated is that he has narrowed the genetic stock. He hasn't varied it, and when the animal is narrowed, for example a cow, the auroch could survive in the wild. It could defend itself, or it could run away, it could use its horns. There's various aspects of things that it could do to survive in the wild, but the modern cow, if you put that out on the African Serengeti, it would not be able to survive on its own. It can't run, it can't defend itself. There's nothing it really has. The cow, the pig, all of these things, there's nothing that they really have. The chicken, they are all dumbed down species, for want of a better phrase. They are all species that have been dumbed down for man's needs, and these species can no longer survive in the wild. And the dog isn't a great example, because dogs probably could survive in the wild on a kind of scavenger basis, but the dog was bred from the wolf, and the wolf can survive 100% completely on its own in the wild. But the way that they do that is that they form packs, etc, etc. So some species of dogs are very capable, and they probably could survive in the wild on a scavenger basis, but it is still a narrowing. The genetic stock of the dog is still a narrowing down from the wolf. It's not an example of a species becoming more complex, it's an example of a species becoming less complex. And pretty much all dogs are less capable of survival in the wild than wolves. So domestication and hybrids are not actually an example of evolution. So why are hybrids not an example of evolution? Because hybrids often have a weaker genome to pass on to their ancestors, and in fact many of them are actually infertile. So a lot of the hybrids, not talking about domestication anymore, a lot of the hybrids that can be created are animals that actually can't even reproduce sexually, and they often have a lot more medical ailment and problems with aggression than the natural species is. So some animals can create hybrids, but it's actually a weaker genome that they're passing on. And if you're passing on a weaker genome, again, it's a big problem for the evolution theory, because that's not a process. If you're continually passing on a weaker genome, or to the point that you actually cannot even reproduce, then that means that you're not fit for natural selection, and there's no way that is an example of a complex process that could create entirely new beings. So if a species is infertile, it cannot breed, and therefore it is not fit for natural selection, therefore it will inevitably die out, therefore it cannot possibly be an example of evolution, because evolution means the ability to adapt to your environment and survive. The additional aspect that most successful hybrids which can survive are animals which have been domesticated by man is not an example of evolution either, because man is an intelligent species who has intervened in his environment to change it. But evolution is the claim that species can evolve by completely natural means through an interaction only with breeding and the natural environment. Additionally, like other hybrids, domesticated animals have a weaker genome than their original ancestral species. So, as I said previously, any animal that man has domesticated is actually a narrowing of the genome, the genetic stock. It's not an increase or a variation of the genetic stock, so that's not an example of evolution. And another thing is that it's not something that, if man hadn't intervened in that process, the natural breeding of the animals, that would never ever have occurred, because it's an intelligent person who's actually disrupting the breeding process of the animals and intentionally making the animals that he sees of the aspects of what he wants. For example, the cow is much fatter than the auroch, and the chicken is much more tamer and dumb than the cock, because over years and years it's easier for man to have a species that is dumbed down and is fattened up for the meat that he wants to select. But those animals would find it very, very hard, if not impossible, to survive in the wild, and their genetic stock would never have reached that stage naturally through just chickens choosing their mates or aurochs choosing their mates. That process never ever would have occurred in the natural environment. It's only by the interception of an intelligent and outside intelligent species that process has occurred. So that's not actually an example of evolution, it's an example actually of intelligent design, which is what I promote. So what was the Neanderthal Man then, to finish this all off? The Neanderthal Man was an anatomically modern human being. However, after surviving in a winter environment for generations, it was a species of man who was adapted to Ice Age survival. The ice also pushed the living environment up to a high altitude, because the ice covered the ground and forced man into a mountainous environment. Consistent with Bergman's principle and Allen's rule, the genetic difference could have become very pronounced over many generations. When specific sets of the genome are selected, the genome is actually narrowed, not increased, as we see with hybrid species. Genetic variety is better for genome expression and the survival of the species in general. However, in the Ice Age microcosm of the environment, it suited humans to be stocky, strong, have bigger noses for taking in the air, etc. However, they were no less capable and were a fully behaviourally modern human species. So that's what I'm saying, that the Neanderthal man, over generations and generations, the gene pool became very pronounced towards Ice Age survival, but it doesn't mean that they were an intermediary species between monkeys and human beings. What it means is that they were a set of human beings who had a narrowed down genetic stock after many, many years of surviving in the Ice Age, and that's all it was. But they were completely modern, and I have shown in these videos that they exhibited all aspects of behavioural modernity. Okay, and that's it. So thanks very much if you watched all of this. I congratulate you. It took a long time for me to research it all, and it takes a long time for me to put my ideas across, because I'm fighting against all the aspects of anti-intellectualism and science becoming the modern replacement of religion and the modern belief system, without people actually going and investigating things themselves. If you reached this far, I thank you very much. If you still don't agree with what I say, that's fine, but I'm glad that perhaps there are people like me and other people like me who are pushing alternative ideas, because I think it's a form of intellectual freedom. And if you can at least try, because science hasn't found these answers, science is still looking for these answers, so I don't see why there should be an intellectual hierarchy in which I'm not allowed to try. Like, I feel like I'm allowed to try, and what I've said, I've tried to back it up as science as absolute best as I can. So thanks very much for listening, and have a nice evening. Thank you. Bye.
Well, this is 2009, and it's the bicentenary of Charles Darwin, and all over the world, eminent evolutionists are anxious to celebrate this. And what they're planning to do is to enlighten us on almost every aspect of Darwin and his life and how he changed our thinking. I say almost every aspect because there's one aspect of this story which they have thrown no light on, and they seem anxious to skirt around it and step over it and talk about something else. So I'm going to talk about it. It's the question of why are we so different from the chimpanzees? We get the genetics keeping on telling us how extremely closely we are, hardly any genes of difference, very, very closely related. And yet, when you look at the phenotypes, there's a chimp, there's a man. It's astoundingly different, no resemblance at all. I'm not talking about airy-fairy stuff about culture or psychology or behavior. I'm talking about ground-based, nitty-gritty, measurable physical differences. That one is hairy and walking on 4 legs. That one is a naked biped. Why? I mean, then if I'm a good Darwinist, I've got to believe there's a reason for that. If we change so much, something must have happened. What happened? Now, 50 years ago, that was a laughably simple question. Everybody knew the answer. They knew what happened. The ancestors of the apes stayed in the trees. Our ancestors went out onto the plain. That explained everything. We had to get up on our legs to peer over the tall grass or to chase after animals or to free our hands for weapons. And we had got so overheated in the chase that we had to take off that fur coat and throw it away. Everybody knew that for generations. But then in the 90s, something began to unravel. The paleontologists themselves looked a bit more closely at the accompanying microfauna that lived in the same time and place as the hominids. And they weren't savanna species. And they looked at the herbivores, and they weren't savanna herbivores. And then they were so clever, they found a way to analyze fossilized pollen. Shock horror. The fossilized pollen was not of savanna vegetation. Some of it even came from lianas, those things that dangle in the middle of the jungle. So we're left with a situation where we know that our earliest ancestors were running around on 4 legs in the trees before the savanna ecosystem even came into existence. This is not something I've made up. It's not a minority theory. Everybody agrees with it. Professor Tobias came over from South Africa and spoke to University College London. He said, everything I've been telling you for the last 20 years, forget about it. It was wrong. We've got to go back to square one and start again. It made him very unpopular. They didn't want to go back to square one. I mean, it's a terrible thing to happen. You've got this beautiful paradigm. You've believed in it from generations. Nobody has questioned it. You've been constructing fanciful things on top of it, relying on it to be as solid as a rock, and now it's whipped away from under you. What do you do? What does a scientist do in that case? Well, we know the answer because Thomas S. Schoon wrote a seminal treatise about this back in 1962. He said, what scientists do when a paradigm fails is, guess what? They carry on as if nothing had ever happened. If they haven't got a paradigm, they can't ask the question. So they say, yes, it's wrong, but supposing it was right. And the only other option open to them is to stop asking the questions. So that is what they have done now. That's why you don't hear them talking about it, yesterday's question. Some of them have even elevated it into a principle, what we ought to be doing. Aaron Filler from Harvard says, isn't it time we stop talking about selective pressures? I mean, why don't we talk about, look, there's chromosomes and there's genes, and recall what we see? Charles Darwin must be spinning in his grave. He knew all about that kind of science, and he called it hypothesis-free science, and he despised it from the bottom of his heart. And if you're going to say, I'm going to stop talking about selective pressures, you can take the origin species and throw it out of the window, because it's about nothing else but selective pressures.